All right, in this lesson, we're going to take a closer look at humans and chimpanzees. Why are humans so profoundly different in important ways than the chimps, yet how are we so similar in other ways? Right? And that is the theme of the movie Ape Genius, which looks at some of the mental differences that might help us understand why it is that humans are the ones that have such advanced culture and so on. And then the film Becoming Human will fill in some of the evolutionary story about the relationships between chimps and humans. So first with Ape Genius. Well, to get a better sense of the differences between chimps and humans, let's consider some of their abilities, some of their capacities. Chimps do have limited cultural traditions. Some chimps will make pointed spears out of wood sticks, right? And some chimps they like to sit in local ponds. And these are considered examples of culture because that behavior is restricted to just one troop of chimps and not the neighboring group of chimpanzees. They have limited cooperation, so they do occasionally cooperate. They've been seen to hunt in groups. And we know from lab studies there is some evidence that they can do imitation. They can imitate the behavior of others. In fact, in the wild, when chimps have been seen to use sticks to fish for termites and so on, or use a rock to crack a nut, it is thought that that behavior spreads throughout the group by imitation. Now, in contrast, humans are a different ballgame, right? We have extremely advanced culture with advanced technology, massive amounts of cooperation. I mean, just to make a spaceship or to make a skyscraper or to make the Hoover Dam or whatever, massive amounts of cooperation, and that is often between strangers. And in terms of imitation, we'll see that humans are more faithful imitators. So there's a story to be told here about the mental abilities of these two species. These two species are alike in certain interesting physical ways, but there are very, very profound mental differences that will help us understand these differences in culture. Okay, so let's take a look at cooperation. So in the film Ape Genius, we saw clever experiments to try to determine whether chimps will spontaneously cooperate. Here we've got some food under a heavy rock. The question is, will two chimps organize themselves so as to pull from the same side? And they tend not to. On the other hand, if one chimp alone tries to pull, can't get it, they will sometimes elicit help from the human researcher standing nearby. So they will request help. They will seek cooperation with the human researcher. They don't seem to be doing it with each other. In other experiments, the situation is there's some food, there are ropes here, and if only one pulls on the rope there, the rope unties and you can't get the food, so you have to pull on both ends of the rope to pull the food together. And again, this can happen, but the cooperation is limited. They have to be friends. The food has to be spread out in the two piles here, so you don't have that kind of competition. Bonobos, one species of chimp, seems to be a little bit more cooperative than the common chimp. But still, even this research suggests that cooperation just does not come easily to chimps. Now, in this research, here we have a chimp being offered two piles of food, right? So a larger pile of food and a smaller pile. But there's a catch in this game. Whatever pile of food the chimp points at, that pile goes to another chimp, leaving the original chimp with the remaining pile. And the funny thing about chimp behavior is that they don't seem to be able to learn this rule. When the larger pile of food is seen, it's as if the chimps cannot resist. They cannot resist the impulse, right? Their emotions get the better of them, and they just automatically reach for the larger pile of food. They can't seem to learn that impulse is causing them to receive the smaller quantity. So researchers take this as evidence that chimps have impulse control problems. They are emotional creatures, and their behavior is strongly driven by emotions. In this case, the idea is the big pile of food just triggers behavior to reach for it. They can't check themselves. They can't resist that impulse. Interestingly, if you teach the chimp to use numerical symbols, and instead of using actual food, you put the symbols on the display, chimps in this situation can learn to point to the smaller numerical symbol in order to get the bigger reward. It's as if learning symbols is a way to gain control over the emotional systems in the brain. So symbols are abstract, and the manipulation of those symbols in our minds may be using brain circuits that are different from the emotional circuits, and so we can behave in a different way when our behavior is guided by this symbolic thinking, as opposed to seeing the actual food itself. Now that is kind of interesting. So in terms of evolution, the ability to acquire symbols then permitted our human ancestors to gain some control over their emotional behavior. In this experiment, researchers presented chimps with this box. We'll call it the magic box. And so within view of the chimp, the researcher would slide this bar out and then poke here and do some tapping, and then finally retrieve some food out of this chamber here. And so the chimps would watch the researcher go through this sequence of behaviors and then finally get the food. And when the box is opaque, so you can't sort of see into it, both chimps and humans imitate pretty well the sequence of steps that lead up to getting the food. But then they changed it up, did an interesting variation. They made a see-through magic box. When it's transparent, you can easily see that the poking and the sliding and the tapping does no good. Well, when the chimps observe the whole procedure with this transparent box, they don't do all that unnecessary stuff. They go right for the food. Interestingly, children still go through the steps. They will tap, slide, and poke before they retrieve the food. And it suggests that human children are somehow prepared to be imitators. They are more faithful imitators. It's almost as if they're expecting to be taught something. Now, why would teachers go through this unnecessary stuff, right? If you could just get the food here. So it's as if this tendency to just follow the directions, follow the leader, is a tendency that reflects that human children are prepared to be learners. They're prepared to be taught something. The chimps, they're interested in food, and they will quickly recognize that all that business is unnecessary. In this experiment, researchers noticed the capacity on the part of children to understand pointing. So when a human will point to something, a child will orient their attention to where the human is pointing. Interestingly, chimps don't seem to be able to do this, right? So they don't seem to understand the intent behind the pointing. Dogs do, and that's an interesting difference, and we don't have time to go into that right now, why there would be a difference there. But this more social species, in terms of social with humans, does seem to be attending to and understanding the intention behind a pointing gesture. Now, why is pointing important? Because early in development, children begin to point, and parents begin to point, and they begin to share attention on some object in the world, right? So here, this they called in the film the triangle, and it's the idea that children will point to some object, but then they will look to the parent to see if the parent is also paying attention to that object. And likewise, parents will get the attention of a child and then orient their attention to some other object so that you can have joint attention. So we can call this shared attention or joint attention, but it's critically important because what this makes possible is teaching, right? So these two humans now can lock in their attention on some common third object, and then they can talk to each other or describe the object or talk about where it came from or whatnot. And you can then more quickly share knowledge if you can share attention on that object that you're talking about. So obviously language is useful here as well, but this idea of paying attention to attention is something that makes teaching possible. So, in summary then, there are some important mental differences between the chimps and the humans. And those mental differences are thought to help explain the massive cultural differences here. So if we think back to the common ancestor then between humans and chimps, this common ancestor had small brains, about the size of chimps today. Lucy represents a stage on the path towards modern humans. Lucy also had a small brain. But after Lucy, there was a significant increase in the size of the brain. And so researchers are interested in what was the trigger there for that, and we'll say more about that in the next part. But one of the key differences, mental differences, that seems to have happened here in this pathway as opposed to the chimp one, is this mental ability to share attention. That makes teaching possible. And when teaching is possible, you can more quickly and efficiently transfer knowledge between individuals and down through the generations. And that makes cultural advancement more rapid. So it also means that you can preserve cultural knowledge in a way that then the next generation can improve upon the cultural knowledge. So you get a ratcheting effect. That makes it possible for an explosion in culture, because we can more quickly and efficiently teach each other knowledge, and then we can build on that knowledge over time and through the generations. There are a host of other mental characteristics that permit cooperation. We have more impulse control, right? So we have a bit more, it's not perfect, obviously, but we have more impulse control, more self-control. And it's thought that some of the frontal parts of the brain, the executive systems of the brain, are more highly developed. They're larger in humans than in the chimps. Of course, the entire brain is bigger in humans, almost 4 times bigger than chimps. But the frontal lobes especially, these executive systems, are more developed in humans. And so this gives us a bit more control over our emotional nature. And that can permit greater amounts of cooperation. And again, this idea that we are faithful imitators. It's as if the young child is prepared to learn. Right, and so the presumption is that the teachers are not going to be communicating senseless information or pointless information, but the stuff that is useful to know. And our brains then seem to be responding to that. We are prepared to follow the leader, prepared to learn sequences of behavior with the assumption that it's going to be useful. So, teaching is one of the major differences between the humans and the chimps. We do it, and they don't. Now, to the extent that we said that chimps did have culture, they make tools, they make sticks to fish out for termites, they make spears, some of them make spears, they might use a rock to crack a nut. That type of knowledge seems to be passed on through imitation. There isn't much evidence that chimps are teaching. And of course, they wouldn't be teaching if they didn't have the mental ability to share attention. That if you can't share attention, it makes teaching very difficult.